And now to establish the link between the principle of non-regression applied to the environmental protection and the right of future generations and what is currently being discussed in Brazil courts, we have Professor Patryck Ayala. He is Associate Professor in Law at Federal University of Mato Grosso, leader of the Jusclima Research Group at the same university, director of the Law for Green Planet Institute, and state attorney of the state of Mato Grosso in Brazil. So Professor Patryck, the floor is yours.
Well, good morning, everyone. Good afternoon in Europe. I'd like to say I'm glad to join this initiative. My pleasure, Professor Emily Gaillard, Professor Michel Poirier, long time no see you. It's a great honor to share this panel with so distinguished researchers and professors I admire. I'd like to say, Professor Emily Gaillard, I follow your research and I have here with me a proof. It's your thesis. We are talking about that. And I'd like to congratulate the University of Caen for this initiative. And I propose to speak about the Brazilian Green Agenda at the Federal Supreme Court. The title of my speech is The Climate Change Litigation Day at the Brazilian Supreme Court, Learning to Build Legal Actions for Future Generations and Nature. So that's why in the international press, the Green Agenda is also known as the Climate Change Litigation Day. And my speech is divided in 3 moments. I start describing what kind of conflicts the court is dealing in the Green Agenda. They are structural, they are complex conflicts in the Global South. Following, I emphasize a way to understand the Brazilian Constitution. This states a legal order that doesn't allow regression. And finally, I propose an interpretation of how the Green Agenda can teach judges to make choices to respect nature and future generations, and social ecological systems. So let's start by talking about the context of the problems of the Global South. First of all, I'd like to support a premise to understand why the Green Agenda is so important for Brazilian environmental law and why it's so important for a right to a stable climate. My premise is social ecological conflicts are being stimulated by institutions. They are stimulated by weak institutions and stimulated by weak rule of law. We have here in Brazil weak institutions and a weak rule of law, and they are stimulating the conflicts, the social ecological conflicts. The great acceleration that defines the Anthropocene describes losses of biological diversity and the environmental damage increasing. The great acceleration also demonstrates that all of this is happening at the same time that there are more environmental legal rules. In the global north, the climate change generally involves problems regarding the control of governmental acts by the judges. More recently, they involve human rights threatened by the actions of companies or corporations. Otherwise, in the global south, these problems are a little more complex. They happen because of a deficient rule of law, imperfect institutions, flawed institutions, and structural and historical conflicts. These are conflicts over serious states of vulnerability. There is social, economical, financial, and cultural vulnerability. And there is also ecological vulnerability. People are vulnerable subjects in the global south because there is a plurality of subjects who suffer violence, including from institutions. They are children, indigenous people, black people, poor people, women in situations of vulnerability. And the human rights of these subjects are systematically violated. The same is true of social ecological systems. The integrity of social ecological systems, and climate is one of them, is also a reality of vulnerability. The Green Agenda describes all of this. The Green Agenda in the Brazilian Supreme Court describes all of this. At this moment, the Brazilian Supreme Court is being challenged to propose solutions in the face of the omission and even the unconstitutional action of the institutions. What is the green agenda? It's no secret that public environmental policies in Brazil are attacked by the same institutions that should enforce these policies every day, especially from 2018 onwards. Some examples are very representative. Decrease in social participation in collective bodies that decide environmental policies, reduction of the public budget to inspect and prevent damages, to combat deforestation, failure to provide assistance to indigenous people, including during the pandemic, obstacles for public agents to exercise their functions in environmental agencies. Brazil is also a signatory of the Paris Agreement, although its environmental commitment is not clear now, and hasn't ratified the Escazú Regional Agreement. This agreement has a section dedicated to defenders of nature. In 2020, Brazil was the fourth most dangerous place for nature defenders. The numbers, unfortunately, keep growing. All these actions are described in the Green Agenda at the Supreme Court. It's in this state of things, Brazilian institutions are not just failing to act. It's different to omission. They are also acting to reduce or eliminate instruments that could collaborate to guarantee the protection of people and nature in a more stable climate system. That's my premise. And it's also the premise that is stated in the Green Agenda in the Brazilian Supreme Court. Institutions are acting against social-ecological systems. How does this happen? Especially with regressive actions. The Brazilian Supreme Court is facing cases in which it's claimed that institutions are acting intentionally to reduce the levels of protection that already existed. Now I'm talking a little about the non-regression principle in Brazilian constitutional jurisprudence. It's the second part of my speech. The Brazilian Constitution is one of the Western texts that has long provided for a state duty to protect the future generations' interests, based on the right to the environment. It's also one of the texts that has for a long time expressly provided for non-regression duties since 1988. When the Brazilian Constitution defines a right to the environment in the interests of future generations, it also allows considering that economic freedoms cannot frustrate these expectations of future generations. They are expectations of a dignified life, expectations of quality of life. These quality of life expectations cannot be protected if there is regression. A second non-regression duty is it's not allowed reduce natural areas under legal protection. If there are scientific grounds that justify their protection, not even the law can reduce such areas. There is a literal forbidden in the Brazilian Constitution. A third non-regression obligation is the duty to preserve and restore essential ecological process. This means that ecological process must have their integrity protected. So it's not allowed regression in the state of the socio-ecological systems. Your integrity must be respected. It's an imperative. There's a really very important topic here. We cannot rely on magical constitutionalism. What does it mean? It's not possible to avoid regression by saying that they cannot happen. It's the product of a Latin American reality. This is a historical tradition. There is a historical tradition here in Latin America of facing serious social inequalities, enormous problems, and structural complex conflicts with the elaboration of large catalog of rights, catalogs of new rights. The policies can transform the reality of these problems and these conflicts. The policies are important, not only the rules. The problem we have here in Brazil, in the Brazilian legal order, is the policies doesn't happen. An important diagnosis on the problem of magical constitutionalism can be found in the first global report on the environmental rule of law. This report shows that nature is not better protected because there are more environmental legal rules, 50 years after the Stockholm Declaration. In the high courts here in Brazil, there is a strong environment commitment about the non-regression principle, mainly because the work of Justice Antonio Harman Benjamin in the Superior Court of Justice, but the Supreme Court only affirmed the principle very recently. Justice Carmen Lucia decision in ADI 4717 confirmed the application of the constitutional rule that prohibits reducing natural areas in 2019. At another more recent moment, in January this year, Justice Rosa Weber, once again a woman, also expressly applied the non-regression principle in the judgment of ADPF 749. The court said at this moment, protecting the fundamental right to the environment is not compatible with legal norms that reduce previously existing levels of protection. The case discussed if it was possible to revoke a rule that protected water resources without having another protected rule in its place. In another case from 2012, the court applied the principle when a new rule authorizes the use of pesticides without risk assessment. Justice Ricardo Lewandowski stated in ADPF 656, it's not possible to replace a risk assessment-based process with a test authorization-based process. But I'd like to draw attention to the use of the principle in the Green Agenda, which is the third part of my speech, and here I end this lecture. The Green Agenda had 7 lawsuits related to relevant socio-ecological conflicts. They are part of the court's 2030 agenda committed to the goals of sustainable development. 4 have already been judged. 4 of 7 have already been judged. None had their decision published so far. Despite of this, their most important arguments are already known of us. I'd like to choose 3 of them. The first is quite similar to the French climate case and the German case, Neubauer case. In this case, two important climate cases, it was decided that the government was not dedicating enough effort to protect the climate. The French case, for instance. Or, according to scientific knowledge, the current rules are insufficient to protect climate, the German case. The first Brazilian case is quite similar. The court has ruled that the National Environmental Council's rules on emissions are no longer compatible with the state of scientific knowledge. The decision is from May 16th this year. The court set a deadline for issuing new rules. If they were not updated, the new World Health Organization air quality standards should be used. The second case is much more recent. It was stated that the Brazilian government is failing to allocate the resources that, by law, have to be used for climate policy. On July 2nd of this year, last Sunday, the virtual trial was concluded. By 10 votes to 1, the Supreme Court concluded that the failure to use resources earmarked for climate policy is unconstitutional. It was said that the failure to finance public environmental policies violates the fundamental right to the environment. In these both lawsuits, the non-regression principle was a very important argument to demonstrate that the behavior of the Brazilian state is not constitutional. In the most recent judgment on July 2nd, Justice Roberto Barroso considered that was confirmed a relationship between the impossibility of using public resources by the Climate Fund since 2019 and the increase in deforestation. It was clearly recognized that the state cannot eliminate existing policies, and the state should enforce the existing policies. The last case is the case of the ADPF 760. Here I conclude my speech. Justice Carmen Lucia's position is already known in extensive text of 159 pages, where it was recognized that the entire set of regressions in the Brazilian environmental policy describes a truly unconstitutional state of things regarding deforestation in the Amazon and the state's failure to protect the right to environment. Justice Carmen Lucia also clearly recognized in the case a process of disorganization and intentional disruption of environmental public policies by the Brazilian state itself. The current government has abandoned a plan to control deforestation in the legal Amazon. This plan was created in 2004. What Justice Carmen Lucia said was, it's not constitutional to eliminate public policies that protect fundamental rights or reduce the protection that these existing policies offer for fundamental rights. All these examples support some paths to build legal actions for future generations, for the climate and for the nature. The Green Agenda and Supreme Court offers us some lessons to reorganize institutions and reorganize a rule of law which is deficient. They seem to me to be the following lessons. The first one, there must be deference to the science. Second one, protecting the vulnerable is contained in the right to a stable climate system. And that right is connected to the state's duties to protect social ecological systems and future generations, and need to improve public participation in the decision-making process. The court expressly stated in all of the chosen cases a non-regression principle. It continues to be very important for climate litigation because the climate systems depend on public policies. The constitution, the Brazilian constitution, defines a duty to protect essential ecological process. However, as it's common in the Latin America, there is a great confidence that structural problems will be better addressed with normative and constitutional changing. As I show it, in Latin American constitutional solutions alone don't always break the structural problems of their societies. A non-regression principle is important because it doesn't allow existing policies, existing public policies to cease to exist, for existing public policies to cease to be carried out. But the climate system needs more. It needs ambition. It needs progressivity. This has been the challenge of a new generation of climate cases, of climate actions, prove and demand that governments need to be more ambitious. Thank you very much for your attention, and thank you very much again, Professor Emily Gaillard, for the generous invitation. And it was fantastic to me to hear two great researchers like you, Professor Michel Trier, and you, Professor Emily Gaillard.